I traded 40 years of hard work, my house, and my children's inheritance for a tropical smile that turned out to be a professional extraction service. Today, my entire net worth is exactly $312, and I'm just a ghost waiting for a flight back to a country where I no longer have a home. Before I tell you how 40 years of my life were erased in less than 3, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't become the next buffalo led to the slaughter in paradise. You need to see exactly how this machine works before it's your turn to pay. If Gary's story served as a warning to you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to help us reach more men before they lose everything. I spent 38 years at a logistics firm in Ohio, staring at flickering monitors and spreadsheets that meant absolutely nothing to my soul. To my boss, I was just a depreciating asset, a line item on a balance sheet that they were waiting to write off the moment I hit 65. Every morning felt like a rehearsal for my own funeral, waking up in a house that echoed with the silence of a life I no longer recognized. I was a ghost in a button-down shirt, performing tasks that a machine could do better, waiting for a clock to tell me I was allowed to stop existing. The divorce wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, agonizing erosion of relevance. After 26 years, my ex-wife looked at me as if I were a piece of old furniture that no longer fit the decor of her new, independent life. When the kids moved out, the glue that held our hollow partnership together simply evaporated, leaving me with half a pension and a suburban house that felt more like a warehouse for regrets. I spent my evenings eating frozen dinners in front of a television that provided the only voice I'd hear for days on end, a silent prisoner of my own success. Walking through a grocery store in America as a 60-year-old man is a masterclass in becoming a phantom. To the young women in line, I was a non-entity, a generic grandfather figure who occupied physical space but possessed zero social value. I felt like I was living in a grayscale world where my only purpose was to pay taxes and wait for my health to inevitably fail. The modern world had moved on to a faster, louder frequency, and I was just a low bit-rate relic from a forgotten era, discarded by a culture that worships the new and treats experience as a liability. My life had become a sterile waiting room for death, a quiet, beige hallway where the only excitement was a scheduled doctor's appointment or a new prescription. I'd look out the window at the gray Ohio winter and realize that my golden years were actually leaden, heavy with the weight of a solitude that no one warned me about. I had done everything right, worked hard, saved my money, and stayed loyal, yet the reward was a cold bed and a future that looked like a long, slow descent into a nursing home where no one would visit. I was just another number waiting to be called. Then one Tuesday night, I found myself scrolling through an expat forum, looking at photos of palm trees and turquoise water that seemed to glow with vibrancy. I saw men my age, guys who looked just as tired as I felt, smiling next to beautiful women who seemed to look at them with admiration. A dangerous thought took root. What if I didn't have to rot in this cubicle? I started to wonder if there was a place where my dollars and my heart could buy me a second chance. I had no idea that my ticket to paradise was actually a death warrant. I started spending my nights hunched over a laptop, the blue light reflecting off my glasses as I searched for an escape from the suffocating gray of Ohio. That was when I first saw the images of Thailand, a place that looked less like a country and more like an oasis in the vast, dry desert of my life. I watched videos of crystalline waters and bustling night markets where everyone seemed to be smiling, a stark contrast to the cold, averted eyes I encountered every day at the supermarket. The promise was intoxicating, a world where my dwindling 401k would transform me from a discarded cog into a man of means and status. I felt a surge of hope I hadn't experienced in decades, convinced that I had finally found the secret door to a second chance at happiness. I devoured content from expat influencers who sat on tropical balconies, sipping cold beers while bragging about how they lived like kings on a fraction of their Social Security checks. They spoke of traditional values and women who actually respected men for being providers, a concept that felt like a beautiful relic from a forgotten age. It wasn't just about the money. It was about reclaiming a sense of masculinity that the modern West had spent years systematically dismantling. I convinced myself that the logic was bulletproof, a simple mathematical equation where moving my assets to a lower-cost environment would yield a life of luxury and companionship. I was so busy calculating the exchange rate that I completely failed to calculate the cost of my own vanity. The more I researched, the more the land of smiles felt like a calling rather than a destination. I joined forums where men my age shared stories of being rescued from their loneliness by partners who treated them with a warmth they hadn't felt since the early years of their first marriages. In America, I was a ghost, a grandfather who only existed to pay bills. But the screen showed me a different reality where I could be the protagonist again. This narrative of the traditional wife became my obsession, a siren song promising that my age and my experience were finally assets instead of liabilities. I began to view my life in Ohio as a prison sentence that was finally nearing its end, and the keys to the cell were just a plane ticket away. I spent months curating my exit strategy, feeling a rush of adrenaline that made me feel 20 years younger. I told myself I was being strategic, that I was smarter than the buffaloes I saw mentioned in the comment sections, those poor saps who lost everything because they didn't have a plan. I had my spreadsheets, my budget for a condo in Jomtien, and a list of red flags I swore I would never ignore. The excitement was a drug, a neurochemical high that blurred the lines between a sound retirement plan and a desperate gamble for affection. I felt like I was finally taking control of my destiny, unaware that I was simply walking into a highly specialized trap designed specifically for men who think they are too clever to be caught. Then, on a humid Tuesday night while the wind howled against my windows in Ohio, I clicked on a profile that changed the trajectory of my life forever. Her name was Molly, and her smile through the screen felt like a warm sun rising over the wreckage of my past. She wasn't a girl in a bar. She looked like a teacher, someone with kindness in her eyes and a modesty that I found utterly captivating. When I sent that first tentative message, my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, convinced that this was the moment my real life was finally beginning. I waited in the silence of my empty house, staring at the online status next to her name, not knowing that her response would be the first step toward my total destruction. The first time I saw Molly in person, the humid Bangkok air felt like a warm embrace rather than a suffocating weight. She was standing outside that small cafe in a simple yellow sundress, her hair falling over her shoulders like a silk curtain, and when our eyes met, she gave me a smile that made my 40 years of Ohio winters melt away instantly. There was no judgment in her gaze, no scanning for flaws or calculating my social utility like the women back home. There was only a soft, welcoming warmth that made me feel like I had finally arrived exactly where I was meant to be. I felt a jolt of electricity in my chest that I thought was dead and buried, convinced that this wasn't just a meeting, but a cosmic correction for a lifetime of loneliness. Every morning of that first month started with a ritual of affection that felt like it was reserved solely for my existence. In America, I was the guy who forgot to take out the trash or the invisible retiree at the end of the bar. But in Molly's small apartment, I was the undisputed king of the world. She would peel fresh mango for me, her small, delicate hands moving with a grace that felt like a choreographed dance of pure devotion. She'd lean in and whisper that I was her special man, her handsome hero, and for the first time in a decade, I actually believed it. I was so starved for validation that I didn't realize I was being fed a gourmet meal of lies, one delicious, addictive bite at a time. It truly felt like I had stepped onto a movie set where the script had been written specifically to heal my broken ego and rewrite my pathetic history. I was the leading man, the rugged Westerner who had finally found his tropical peace, and Molly was the perfect co-star, hitting every emotional mark with a precision that I mistook for genuine passion. We walked through the night markets of Sukhumvit, her hand tucked firmly into mine, and I looked at my reflection in the shop windows and didn't see an aging, discarded logistics manager. I saw a man who was finally living the life he deserved, the star of a masterpiece, never suspecting that the director was already planning my character's brutal and humiliating exit. My blood felt like it had been replaced with high-octane fuel during those first few weeks of our honeymoon phase. The chronic back pain that had plagued me for years simply evaporated, replaced by an incredible energy that kept me awake until the early hours of the morning, talking and laughing over cheap beer and spicy street food. We spent hours in those small roadside stalls, the neon lights reflecting in her dark, attentive eyes, and I felt a sense of belonging that I had never found in my entire career. I was young again, vibrant and essential, a far cry from the gray phantom who used to wander the grocery aisles in the dead of a Midwest winter, waiting for the clock to run out. Our first real trip together was to a small island called Koh Kud, a place that felt like it had been plucked straight from a luxury travel brochure and polished specifically for my arrival. We stayed in a private wooden bungalow right on the turquoise water, where the only sound was the gentle rhythmic lapping of the waves against the stilts beneath us. Molly would wake me up by kissing my forehead, her hair smelling of jasmine and coconut oil, and we'd spend the entire day swimming in water so clear it felt like we were floating in liquid glass. It was a paradise I didn't think existed for men like me. A magnificent reward for all those years of grinding in the cold corporate machine. Communication was a beautiful fractured dance of broken English and exaggerated gestures that somehow felt more intimate than any complex conversation I'd ever had with my ex-wife. We didn't need sophisticated sentences to express what I thought was a soul-deep connection. A soft touch on the arm or a shared laugh over a clumsy translation was enough to convince me we were soulmates. I convinced myself that this silence was a sign of her traditional values, a refreshing lack of the nagging and conflict that had defined my Western relationships. I didn't see the information asymmetry for what it was, a high wall she had built to keep me from ever truly knowing the strategist who was systematically dismantling my future. Everywhere we went in those early days, I was treated with a level of deference that felt intoxicatingly new and dangerously addictive. The waitresses, the taxi drivers, and even the strangers on the street seemed to look at us with a knowing nod of approval, as if they were all in on the secret of my incredible luck. I was the Fu Yai, the big man with the beautiful woman on his arm, and my ego swelled to fill the vast vacuum of my previous hollow life. I felt like I had finally cracked the code of human happiness, finding a secret shortcut to the respect and admiration that I had spent my entire adult life failing to earn back in Ohio. The domesticity of our new life together was a masterclass in psychological comfort and emotional grooming. Molly would iron my shirts with a meticulousness that felt like a silent love letter, and she'd spend hours cooking elaborate meals that filled our small apartment with the intoxicating sense of galangal and lime. She made me feel cared for in a way that was almost maternal, anticipating my needs before I even realized I had them, from a cold drink to a soft pillow. It was a cocoon of absolute safety, a soft velvet trap that made the outside world feel distant and irrelevant. I was so comfortable in that artificial warmth that I never bothered to look for the thermostat. I would look back at my old life in Ohio and shudder at the memory of those frozen dinners and the oppressive, ringing silence of my suburban tomb. I'd compare the cold, clinical reality of my past to the vibrant sensory explosion of my present and feel a profound, desperate sense of relief. I believed I had escaped the American loneliness, the slow rot of the soul that kills men my age long before their hearts actually stop beating. I was convinced that I had been rescued from a drowning ship and brought to a shore where the sun never set. I was so grateful for the rescue that I didn't notice the rescuer was busy checking my pockets for gold. In those early golden months, the money flowed out of my retirement account like water from a broken dam. But I viewed every transaction as a wise investment in our shared future. A new high-end phone for her, a small gift for her sister's school fees, a weekend trip to a luxury resort in Hua Hin. It all felt like the legitimate cost of building a beautiful life together. Each request was wrapped in such overwhelming gratitude and physical affection that saying no felt like a cruel betrayal of the magic we were creating. I was buying her happiness, but more importantly, I was buying the feeling that I was a provider, a man of substance who could change a woman's destiny. I truly believed that I was the one brilliant exception to every cynical cautionary tale I had ever read on those bitter expat forums. I looked at the other men in Pattaya, the ones with the 1,000-yard stares and the stained t-shirts, and told myself that they were the buffaloes because they were weak, cheap, or fundamentally stupid. My relationship was different because Molly was different. She was a teacher, she was family-oriented, and she truly loved me for the man I was inside, not the balance in my bank account. I was so blinded by my own arrogance that I mistook a highly refined professional extraction service for a genuine romantic miracle, ignoring the reality that miracles don't usually come with an invoice. We spent our last night of that first honeymoon phase on a rooftop bar overlooking the glittering neon sprawl of Bangkok, toasting to a future that looked brighter than the city lights below. Molly leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered that she wanted to take me to her village to meet her parents, a gesture I took as the ultimate sacred sign of lifelong commitment. I felt like I had finally reached the summit of my life, looking down at a world I had finally conquered with my heart and my wallet. Looking back, I should have realized that everything was just a little too perfect, a script that had been rehearsed 1,000 times before I ever arrived. But I was so desperate to be the hero that I refused to see the tragedy unfolding. The first crack appeared on a humid Tuesday afternoon while we were sharing a quiet lunch by the river. Molly's brother, a young man I had only seen in grainy Facebook photos, had supposedly crashed his motorbike, and the local police were demanding a settlement to keep him out of a jail cell. She didn't ask for a fortune, just 8,000 baht, about $250, to make the problem go away before the sun went down. To a man who had spent 40 years managing million-dollar logistics accounts, it was a rounding error, an insignificant gesture of goodwill to the woman who had brought color back into my gray life. I saw her tears and felt a surge of protective masculinity that I hadn't experienced in decades, convinced I was being a hero rather than a mark. But I failed to see the tiny, jagged fracture it left in my financial resolve. I told myself that this was simply the cultural tax of living in a world where the social safety net is made of family rather than government agencies. In Ohio, I would have spent that same amount on a single car repair or a high-end dinner without a second thought. So why was I hesitating to help the people Molly loved? She treated me like a conquering king after I handed over the cash, her gratitude so overwhelming and physical that it silenced the quiet alarm bells ringing in the back of my mind. I was passing a stress test of my character, proving to her and to myself that I was a man of substance who could be relied upon in a crisis. I was so busy basking in the glow of her validation that I didn't realize I was merely confirming my credit limit for the extraction team. Then came the sick buffalo call, though in my specific tragedy it was Molly's mother's failing heart that required an immediate private clinic intervention. Molly was inconsolable, sobbing into her pillow about the state of rural hospitals and the terrifying cost of specialized care that her family could never hope to afford. I remember thinking that $1,500 was a small price to pay to keep the woman who gave birth to my soulmate alive and healthy. I didn't ask for medical records or a breakdown of the costs. I simply made the wire transfer, fueled by a dangerous mix of pity and a desperate need to be the savior of her story. I was financing a medical miracle, unaware that the only thing being operated on was my dwindling bank balance. I began to view my retirement savings as a massive reservoir of water, a deep and steady pool designed to keep our tropical garden lush and green for the rest of our lives. A few $100 here and 1,000 there felt like nothing more than a few drops lost to evaporation in the intense midday sun, barely impacting the overall level. I was the master of the dam, controlling the flow and ensuring that the woman I loved never felt the sting of the poverty she had escaped. I justified every withdrawal as a long-term investment in our shared happiness, a way to cement our bond before the inevitable decline of old age. I was so focused on the calm surface of the water that I didn't notice the foundation of the dam was starting to erode from within. By the 8th month, the requests became more frequent, but they were always wrapped in such elaborate emotional packaging that I felt like a monster for even considering a no. There was a merit-making ceremony at the local temple that required a significant donation for our future luck, a cousin's sudden school fees, and an urgent roof repair for the family farmhouse. Each time, Molly would hold me a little tighter, her affection intensifying in direct proportion to the size of the international wire transfer I initiated from my laptop. I felt like a foo yai, a big man who was finally using his life's work for something visceral and meaningful, rather than just watching numbers change on a cold screen. I didn't see that each emergency was a calculated probe, searching for the exact point where my generosity would finally break. I started to develop a strange, defensive anxiety that I chose to mask with even more aggressive spending on our lifestyle. If I felt a flicker of doubt about a specific request, I'd buy us a weekend at a 5-star resort in Krabi, just to prove to myself that I was still the one in total control of the finances. I was playing a high-stakes game of double down, trying to outrun my own intuition by increasing my commitment to the fantasy of our perfect life. I told myself that Molly was a victim of her circumstances and that my wealth was the only thing standing between her and a life of misery. I was her knight in shining armor, and I refused to count the gold coins I was losing as long as she kept smiling. I didn't realize that I was actually dealing with a village board of directors that saw me as a high-yield treasury bond reaching its maturity date. Every dollar I sent didn't just disappear into a hospital bill or a roof repair. It was distributed among a collective that saw me as a resource to be managed with the cold precision of a mining operation. To them, I wasn't a man with a history, a family back home, or a soul. I was a farang with an ATM card that never seemed to decline. Molly was the primary operator, and her duty was to ensure the shareholders back in the Isan province were satisfied with their quarterly returns on her investment in me. I was so caught up in the romance that I forgot that every professional business venture has a very specific exit strategy. The first big one hit when Molly suggested we buy a small plot of land near her village to build a forever home where we could retire in total peace. She explained with a practiced modesty that as a foreigner, I couldn't legally own the land, but putting it in her name would be the ultimate symbol of my trust and our permanent union. I spent $30,000 on a piece of dirt I had never even stood upon, convinced that I was finally putting down roots in this beautiful, welcoming soil. I felt a profound sense of pride as I watched the money leave my account, believing I was building a fortress for our future security. I didn't realize I was just paying for a house that I was technically only a guest in. I started checking my Vanguard account every single morning, watching the total dip below the safe threshold I had meticulously set for myself back in Ohio. I'd see the red numbers on the screen and feel a cold, sickening knot of dread in my stomach, a sensation I would quickly drown in a bottle of expensive wine or another shopping spree for Molly. I was no longer living on the interest of my hard-earned pension. I was cannibalizing the principal, eating my own future to sustain a present that was starting to feel increasingly forced. I justified it by telling myself that the exchange rate was still in my favor, a convenient lie I repeated until the logic started to sound like a prayer. The communication between us began to undergo a subtle, terrifying shift, becoming a negotiation of needs and rewards that I tried desperately to ignore. The I love you began to feel more like a thank you for the payment, and the silence in our luxury apartment grew heavy with the weight of her unstated expectations. If I hesitated on a request or asked too many questions about where the money was going, Molly would become distant and cold. a tactical withdrawal of affection that only ended when I restored the financial flow. I was no longer a partner in a romantic relationship. I was a subscriber to a premium emotional service, and the free trial period had ended months ago. I was terrified of what would happen if the subscription lapsed, so I kept paying. I started to hide the true extent of my spending from my children back in America, creating a digital fantasy where the cost of living was low and my investments were thriving. I didn't want them to think their father was a gullible old fool, so I lied about the consulting work I was doing and the growth of my accounts. In reality, I was a man on a sinking ship throwing his gold overboard in the desperate hope that it would somehow make the vessel light enough to float. I was more afraid of being wrong about Molly than I was of being broke, a psychological trap that kept me anchored to my own inevitable destruction. I was the architect of my own cage, and I was making sure the bars were gold-plated. The final straw of this phase came when Molly's father allegedly lost the family farm to a local loan shark in a gambling debt that threatened their entire existence. She came to me trembling, her face pale and her eyes red from crying, saying they would be homeless by the end of the month unless I could provide $20,000 to clear the title. It was a staggering amount, a significant chunk of what remained of my liquid assets, but she promised with a solemn vow that it was the very last thing they would ever ask of me. I looked at her, saw the woman who had saved me from the Ohio winter, and I made the wire transfer that same afternoon. I felt like a savior as I hit the confirm button, but as the money cleared, I saw a look in her eyes I hadn't seen before, a look of a hunter who realized the trap had finally, mercifully, closed. Molly didn't wait long after I saved her family farm to suggest the ultimate anchor for our lives, a permanent home on a plot of land near her village. She sat me down with architectural sketches of a modern villa nestled in the rice fields of her home province, framing it not as a request, but as a blueprint for our shared immortality. She spoke of the peace and the respect we would command as the big family of the area. It felt like the logical conclusion to my long, lonely journey from Ohio, a physical manifestation of the second chance I thought I'd earned. I spent 3 nights staring at my bank statements, performing a desperate kind of financial alchemy to justify the risk. The construction would cost $80,000, a massive sum, but still less than half of what a dilapidated shack would cost back in Columbus. I told myself I was being a savvy investor, moving my depreciating U.S. dollars into hard assets where my lifestyle would be guaranteed forever. It felt like a strategic pivot, a way to lock in my happiness before the next global recession or lonely winter could touch me. I was jumping off a cliff, convinced that wings would sprout. A febrile electric anxiety hummed under my skin as the deadline for the land deposit approached, a feeling I mistook for the thrill of a new beginning. I was liquidating the core of my 401k, the very money I had spent 40 years accumulating in windowless offices, and the weight of that sacrifice felt almost holy. I convinced myself that true love required a leap of faith, a total surrender of my Western cynicism in exchange for a seat at the table of a traditional family. Every doubt was met with a level of affection that felt like a drug, reinforcing the fantasy. The legal reality of Thai land ownership was a jagged pill I swallowed without water, convincing myself that trust was more valuable than a title deed. I knew I couldn't legally own the dirt beneath the house, but Molly's name on the document felt like a minor technicality compared to our soul-deep connection. I told myself that marriage was the ultimate contract, and that a piece of paper couldn't possibly override the loyalty she had shown me. I was willfully blind, choosing to be a guest in my own investment. The village board was already celebrating their new asset while I played CEO. Molly's emotional grooming reached its peak during those final days, as she treated me with a reverence that bordered on the divine, making me feel essential. She'd take me to the site, pointing at the empty dirt and describing where our garden would grow and where we'd sit to watch the sunset in our old age. The pressure was subtle but relentless, a soft, velvet vice that tightened every time I checked the transfer screen on my laptop. I felt like I was finally buying my way out of the American loneliness. I couldn't see the extraction machine shifting into highest gear. On the morning of the wire transfer, my hand was shaking as I authorized the release of $84,000 from my main retirement fund. This was the point of no return, the moment I officially crossed the line from a retired expat to a man whose survival was tethered to a woman who spoke a different language. I looked at Molly, who was watching with an intensity I mistook for anticipation. I took a deep breath, felt the cold sweat on my neck, and clicked confirm. As the transaction successful message flashed, a piercing silence filled the room, and she didn't touch my hand. I was standing in the middle of our half-finished living room, admiring the expensive teak window frames I'd just paid $5,000 to install, when Molly's phone buzzed on the granite countertop. She was in the shower, the steam filling the hallway while I stood there, feeling like the king of my own tropical castle. Usually I respected her privacy, but the screen stayed lit long enough for me to see a photo of the very house I was standing in, sent to a contact labeled simply as "My Real Husband" in a crude automatic translation. My heart did a slow, sickening roll in my chest as I realized the pink cloud I'd been living in was about to be struck by lightning. I grabbed the device with trembling fingers, my thumb hovering over the screen like it was a live grenade. I bypassed her simple passcode, her own birthday, which I had memorized like a sacred date, and opened the chat history. I scrolled past hundreds of photos of my bank transfers, my emergency gifts, and my smiling, oblivious face at the village merit-making ceremonies. Every single one of them had been forwarded to this man, accompanied by laughing emojis and cold, calculated discussions about how much the old buffalo had left in his American accounts. The translation tax I'd been paying wasn't just a language barrier. It was a tactical blackout designed to keep the mark blind while the vault was emptied. The shower stopped abruptly, and Molly stepped out, wrapping herself in a plush silk robe I'd bought her in Bangkok for our anniversary. When she saw me holding her phone, the traditional, modest woman I'd worshipped for 2 years vanished in a heartbeat, replaced by a cold, predatory stranger. The soft, melodic voice was gone, replaced by a sharp, guttural command in Thai as she snatched the device from my hand, her eyes turning into black, unfeeling stones. There was no apology, no tears of shame, and no desperate explanation for the betrayal. There was only a chilling, professional indifference that made me realize I was no longer a person to her, but a contract that had reached its final expiration date. Within seconds, the village board of directors appeared as if they'd been crouched in the shadows, waiting for this exact cue to end the performance. Her brother, the one whose fictional motorbike accident I'd paid for, and her cousin stood in the doorway of the house I thought was my fortress, their arms crossed and their expressions devoid of the fake warmth they'd used to groom me. They didn't need to speak English for me to understand the new hierarchy of the room. I was a tenant being evicted from a property I had fully financed, a minority shareholder who had just been voted out of his own life by a collective that had never once seen me as human. I frantically pulled up my banking app on my own phone, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps as I tried to see how much of my life's work was left standing. The bug-out fund I thought I'd hidden in a separate account was gone, drained through a series of clever authorized transfers I must have signed during my drunken, infatuated nights in Pattaya. My retirement wasn't a reservoir anymore. It was a dry, cracked basin of red numbers and insufficient funds notifications that mocked my 40 years of Ohio labor. Every hour I'd spent at that logistics firm, every gray winter I'd endured, had been liquidated into a driveway I wasn't allowed to park in anymore. I looked past the men in the doorway and saw a silver pickup truck pulling into the gravel path, the one I'd bought for her father's farm work last summer. A man stepped out, a local around Molly's age, wearing the gold watch I'd reported stolen from my bedside table 3 weeks ago. He didn't look at me with anger or even triumph. He just walked up to Molly, put a proprietary arm around her waist, and handed her a set of keys to the front door that I didn't recognize. The curtain didn't just fall, it collapsed, revealing that the village teacher was already wearing her wedding ring, the one with the diamond I'd never seen before. They didn't even give me time to pack my pride, let alone my belongings, before the physical removal began. Within 20 minutes of that cold revelation, the men I had financed, the brother with the fake crash and the cousin with the school fees, physically escorted me to the edge of the gravel driveway I'd paid $5,000 to pave. Molly stood on the porch of the villa, the house that my 40 years of Ohio sweat had built, and she didn't even look at me as she handed the new keys to the man wearing my stolen gold watch. I was a trespasser on my own investment, a ghost being exorcised from a life I'd bought but never owned. The village board had finished their harvest, and I was just the discarded husk of a man, left to rot in the midday sun. I sat on a plastic crate at a roadside bus stop, staring at the glowing screen of my phone until the battery began to die, just like my future. My total net worth, after liquidating every dream and sacrificing every cent of my children's inheritance, was exactly $312. The extraction machine hadn't just taken my money, it had performed a surgical removal of my dignity, leaving me with nothing but a carry-on bag and a heart that felt like it had been put through a paper shredder. I was a disposable battery that had finally been drained to zero, tossed into the weeds the second the power ran out. There is no mercy in a business transaction disguised as a romance, only the cold, hard mathematics of a bank account that no longer has anything left to give. As I waited for the local bus to take me away from the wreckage, I watched the villagers pass by. The same people who had bowed to me and called me Fu Yai just weeks before. Now they looked through me as if I were made of glass, their smiles replaced by a chilling collective amnesia. In this world, a man without money has no shadow and no voice. I had become a dead buffalo, a carcass that had already been picked clean by the vultures I called my family. The land of smiles had turned into a wall of absolute silence, a landscape where my existence was a shameful secret they were all eager to bury. I realized then that I wasn't a survivor of a tragedy. I was just a failed budget line in a village development plan that had successfully reached its conclusion. The ride back to Bangkok was a blur of neon lights and humid air that felt like it was choking the very life out of my lungs. I felt like a survivor of a massive shipwreck who had somehow crawled onto a barren shore with nothing but the tattered clothes on my back, looking back at the dark water where my entire life had just vanished. Every mile took me further from the paradise I thought I'd found and closer to the cold, humiliating reality of a country I no longer recognized. I was a phantom passenger on a journey toward an empty house, a man who had traded his gold for a handful of salt and a belly full of regret. My identity had been erased, replaced by the heavy, crushing weight of a failure that I would have to carry for whatever time I had left. Standing in Suvarnabhumi Airport, I caught my reflection in the same glass partition where I had arrived 3 years ago, bursting with a pathetic, arrogant hope. The man staring back wasn't a handsome hero or a strategic investor. He was a broken 63-year-old fool with gray skin and eyes that had seen the end of the world. If you are sitting in your living room right now, dreaming of a tropical escape and a woman who finally understands you, look at me and see your own funeral. Don't be the next buffalo to march into the slaughterhouse thinking it's a sanctuary, because once the extraction is complete, the only thing waiting for you is a one-way ticket to a life you no longer own. Thailand is a beautiful dream, but for men like us, it's a retirement plan with a pulse that eventually stops beating the moment you run out of cash. If you're sitting there right now, scrolling through those tropical forums and thinking your story will be different, let me ask you one thing. What makes you so special? I thought I was the smart one, the strategic Puyai who could outrun the statistics. But I was just a 4-year treasury bond reaching maturity for a family I hadn't even met. You aren't entering a marriage. You're entering a high-stakes extraction machine where you are the only investor, but hold 0% of the voting shares. My ruin wasn't a mistake. It was a mathematical certainty the moment I valued a smile over a title deed. Listen to the rules I learned too late. When the sick buffalo calls begin, it's not an emergency. It's a subscription model testing your credit limit. Your soulmate has a primary loyalty to the village board of directors, a collective where you are a resource to be shared, not a partner to be loved. Never forget the ATM expiration date. The second your health fails or your bank account hits zero, the traditional values evaporate like mist. You are a disposable battery brought in to power a lifestyle you'll never own. If the money stops, the love stops. Period. Don't gamble your life on a feeling. I am currently sitting in a cold terminal, waiting for a flight back to an Ohio winter with nothing but a carry-on bag full of stained clothes. I have become a lighthouse built on the jagged rocks of my own shipwreck, flashing a warning to every other ship sailing toward these treacherous shores. Don't be the next buffalo to march into the slaughterhouse thinking it's a sanctuary. If you want to keep your dignity and your life's work, stay away. Paradise is just a professional extraction service with a beautiful pulse, and once you're empty, you're discarded. Don't be like me. My story is over. Yours hasn't ended yet.